Hi, and welcome to When Silence Breaks. Before we begin the video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and if you've made it this far, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now get comfortable and join us for a story that proves sometimes silence can teach the most powerful lesson of all. On the forums where people leave stories that don't need embellishment, they'd say Catherine Mitchell had a quiet life as a science teacher in Minnesota, but that doesn't explain the exact weight she carried on her shoulders that late September morning, when the first frost left glass on the windshield and the car's cassette player still smelled of new pencils. She was 52 years old, with the school bell routine, lukewarm coffee in a metal thermos with a crescent-shaped dent, and a wedding ring that seemed heavier since the funeral. Joshua, a methodical engineer, had died as he lived, without fuss, with his shirt ironed and his heart betraying the script of each day. What no one saw, not even her daughter Jenna, who carried a splintered bitterness, was that Catherine's grief wasn't an open cry, but a collection of silences. The house with the two-colored post-it notes he used, the drawer with screws sorted by the millimeter, the gap in the table where his cup left a perfect circle. In that domestic order, the envelope from Attorney Winters arrived. A will, an iron key as cold as a winter's tongue, and a letter in an architect's handwriting. Joshua asked her to come to a farm in Alberta, Maple Creek Farm. The same one that for years had been forbidden territory to her, almost a censored word in their conversations. The envelope seemed like a ticket to a language she had never wanted to learn, but that day, for the first time, she decided to speak. The journey began with the kind of everyday bravery you don't see in movies. Double-locking the door, leaving food for the neighbor's cat, and recording the car's mileage in a notebook as if keeping track could keep fear at bay. Catherine crossed the state, looking at soybean fields already turning brown, gas stations with lukewarm apple pies, and windshields dotted with insects like makeshift constellations. At the border, the agent asked what she was going for. She replied, "To look at some property," and felt the phrase sounded borrowed. Alberta greeted her with hills that looked like the backs of sleeping animals and maple trees dressed as if the season had called for their finest suit. Maple Creek wasn't abandoned or defeated. It was a tidy domain, with new fences, a barn that smelled of freshly planed wood, and a main house where the windows reflected the sky like silver platters. Inside, the air carried a mixture of Marseille soap and dried hay. On the dining room table, the silver laptop, a red rose placed with millimetric precision, and a post-it note, "Play." Catherine pressed it. Joshua appeared on the screen with the serenity that hurt. "If you're here, my love, it means my plan worked. To build something worthy of you before my heart grew weary." She didn't cry. She clung to the back of the chair like someone crossing a narrow bridge, and understood that this day, not the day of the funeral, would truly be the beginning of everything. Catherine spent the first sleepless night pacing the halls of the house as if each room held a foreign memory that somehow knew her. The videos kept appearing one after another on the desktop, files with simple names, day 2, day 3. Containing snippets of Joshua speaking from the workshop or the barn, telling her anecdotes, apologizing for not having shared his illness sooner. As the screen projected his face, the house seemed to breathe with her, and the silence became a tangible echo. Catherine discovered that he had painted every wall in her favorite colors, even restoring an old stable just to house horses like those of her adolescence. She felt loved and betrayed at the same time. How could he hide so much love behind so much silence? At dawn, she opened the window and saw the countryside covered in fog, as if the world awaited her next move. At mid-morning, a black van arrived, disrupting the balance of the landscape. 3 men got out with the familiarity of those who already feel like owners, the Mitchell brothers. Expensive suits, shiny watches, and looks that smelled like lawyers. They claimed that Joshua had bought the property while mentally incapacitated, that the will was a manipulation, and that Maple Creek belonged to the family by moral right. Catherine, her voice still trembling, invited them to leave, but they smiled like those who knew the battle was just beginning. When they finally left, she closed the door and returned to her laptop. Joshua had warned her in a video recorded months earlier that this would happen, that the brothers would try to appropriate the legacy, and that she should look for a blue folder hidden in the attic. There, among dust and aged wood, Catherine found the documents that would prove the legality of the purchase. And as she held those pages, she realized that her mourning had become a mission. The attic smelled of old wood and dried leaves, as if time had stopped at the edges of every beam. Catherine brought the blue folder down to the dining room, spread it out on the table, and spent hours reviewing each document. Deeds, certificates, transfers, all with the meticulousness Joshua had taught her in everyday life. Among the papers, she found a note folded in 4 that read, "When you feel fear, remember who you are without my shadow." That simple, direct phrase pierced her chest like a key opening a door that had always been there. For the first time since the funeral, she wept uncontrollably, not because of death, but because of the dimension of love she was only just discovering. At that moment, a gust of wind opened a window and a leaf from the field floated in, landing on the laptop keyboard, just above the file name Day 5. Catherine interpreted this as a sign. She would follow the path he had left, step by step, even if it hurt. The next video led her to a new revelation. Joshua was sitting on a bench facing the lake, his hair blowing in the wind. He explained that he had rebuilt Maple Creek not only as a refuge for her, but as a shield against his brother's greed. "They never understood the value of the invisible," he said with a serenity that contrasted with the gravity of his words. On the screen, he briefly showed some plans and mentioned oil deposits under the western part of the property, the real reason for the dispute. Catherine stopped the video. Her breathing quickened. Everything she believed to be a romantic gesture had an underlying theme of strategy and survival. Suddenly, the love story mingled with an intrigue that overwhelmed her, and the quiet widow began to transform, almost without realizing it, into the guardian of a secret that could destroy or save the Mitchell name. That night, the silence of the farmhouse was so thick she could hear her own pulse. Catherine left her laptop on the table and walked out onto the porch, wrapped in a blanket. The Canadian air had a different, almost medicinal edge. On the horizon, the maple trees seemed to burn in the last glow of the sun, and for the first time in a long time, she felt alive. She remembered the years Joshua had forbidden her to talk about family, the way he deflected any conversation about her past, and realized that his reserve wasn't coldness. It was a way of protecting her. She went back inside and began sorting through the papers, classifying them by date and name, as if the act of organizing could give her control over something. When the clock struck 11, she lit a candle and wrote a single line in her journal. "If he planned all this, I'll finish what he started." The next day, an old pickup truck arrived with the distinctive sound of engines long past their useful life. Ellis, the foreman who had cared for the farm for the past few years, got out. A man with a weathered face, light eyes and hands that smelled of oil and wood. Upon seeing her, he bowed his head respectfully and said, "Mr. Mitchell knew you were coming. He left me instructions to help you." Catherine invited him in, and over coffee and anecdotes, she learned that Joshua had spent months working in the old barn, always at night, always alone. Ellis confessed that a month before he died, his boss had asked him not to let anyone near that building. Intrigued, Catherine asked him to take her there. The path to the barn was covered with crunchy leaves and the smell of damp earth. The interior was dark and empty, except for a trapdoor covered with a carpet. Ellis nodded wordlessly. "That's what he made me promise never to touch," he murmured. "O ChatGPT dice." Beneath the trapdoor, a narrow staircase descended into an underground chamber that smelled of metal and dust. Catherine went down. With a flashlight, her heart pounding. What she found there didn't look like a simple basement, but rather a kind of hidden command room. Tables with plans spread out, labeled filing cabinets, a blacked-out screen, and on the wall, an inscription in white letters. War Room. Joshua had built his own strategy center, a refuge for secrets and truths. On a metal shelf, there were folders with familiar names, Robert, Allen, and David Mitchell. Catherine opened them with trembling hands and saw what she would never have imagined. Copies of fraudulent transfers, call recordings, manipulated contracts, and printed emails that demonstrated years of family corruption. Joshua had anticipated everything. In a short video saved on an external drive, he spoke directly to her. "If you get here, it means they've already appeared. Don't be afraid of them. The truth is on your side." Catherine spent the rest of the night reading each document, jotting down dates, names, and figures. With each revelation, the image of the 3 brothers transformed. They were no longer relatives grieving over an inheritance, but predators accustomed to winning at any cost. She realized that Joshua had not only wanted to protect her, but to clear the Mitchell name before it was too late. In a corner, she discovered a wooden box with a carved inscription, "For her eyes only." Inside, she found a silver necklace with a small maple leaf pendant and a note. "When in doubt, look at this and remember that everything I did was for you." Catherine held it between her fingers, feeling an inexplicable warmth run through her hands. That mixture of love and strategy, of tenderness and war moved her deeply. There she understood that her grief had transformed into purpose, and that Maple Creek was not an inheritance. It was a mission. At dawn, Ellis found her asleep on the table, the flashlight still lit and the documents scattered around her. When she awoke, he brought her a cup of coffee and said in a low voice, "Mr. Mitchell would be proud of you, ma'am." Catherine nodded silently. She had gone from a woman devastated by loss to a strategist who could no longer afford to grieve. She decided to contact Attorney Winters and explain what she had discovered. He listened incredulously, but advised her to remain silent. If the brothers learned of the existence of this evidence, they would try to seize it or destroy it. Catherine understood that discretion was her best shield. She spent the days organizing all the material, backing it up on external drives, and keeping copies in the war room. Every night she lit a candle, watched a new video of Joshua, and took notes. Her husband had left her not only a legacy, but also a precise instruction. The truth, when calmly presented, is more disarming than any shout. That phrase stayed with her like a mantra, and as she watched another of the videos in which Joshua guided her through the layout of the property, Catherine thought that maybe she wasn't the only one who needed to hear something like that. The tone of his voice softened on the screen as if speaking through time. "And if you too continue reading this, perhaps you'll understand that love sometimes hides in the most unusual strategies. Tell me, from where are you seeing this story?" The phrase, although directed at no one in particular, felt like a bridge between her pain and that of the world. After that, Catherine put away her laptop and went out into the yard. Horses, 2 young mares approached the fence. She stroked them and realized that Joshua's plan had been deeper than it seemed. Maple Creek wasn't just a property. It was a stage set for her transformation, a mirror where she would learn to recognize herself without depending on anyone else. Days later, the tranquility of the farm was shattered by an unexpected email from her daughter Jenna. She said her aunt and uncle had told her the truth about the will and that she would be traveling to Canada to sort things out. Catherine felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. She knew the Mitchells wouldn't give up easily, and using their daughter was their cruelest move. When Jenna arrived, she greeted her at the entrance, her eyes tired and her expression hardened. She felt a mixture of anger and confusion. "Mom, what did you do? Why did Dad hide all this from us?" she asked without even hugging her. Catherine took a deep breath, trying not to break down. "It wasn't me who hid, honey. It was him to protect us." But Jenna wasn't listening. She repeated her aunt and uncle's arguments, convinced that taking back the farm would honor the family legacy. That night, Catherine heard her crying in the next room and realized that the poison of manipulation had already taken effect. The next day, as the wind battered the studio windows, Catherine made a decision to show Jenna the video Joshua had recorded just for her. In the recording, he appeared thinner, with graying hair and moist eyes. "Daughter, if you see this, it means my brothers have already come looking for you. They are not family, they are my outstanding debt. They stole my youth, my family name, and the hope of giving you a clean future. I changed countries to save myself, and to give you something better." Jenna listened without blinking, tears slipping silently. Finally, Joshua said, "Don't forgive me for being silent. Forgive me for protecting you too late." When the screen went black, Jenna collapsed in her mother's arms. No words were enough. What united them in that moment was the naked truth. For the first time since the funeral, Catherine felt she wasn't alone in Maple Creek. For the next few days, mother and daughter remained together on the estate, reviewing every video and every document. Catherine showed her the evidence of corruption, the deeds, the plans for the oil reserves, and the reports Joshua had meticulously prepared. Jenna went from bewilderment to outrage. How could they be so cruel? She asked upon discovering that her uncles had tried to declare her father mentally incompetent before his death. Catherine replied calmly, "Because greed always needs to justify its guilt." In that shared silence, the two understood that they were defending not only a material inheritance, but the honor of a man who had been betrayed by his own blood. At night, they lit a bonfire in front of the house, and Jenna, staring into the flames, whispered, "Dad always said that fire reveals what darkness tries to hide." Catherine nodded, feeling that this phrase was a kind of belated blessing. The following Monday, the Mitchell brothers reappeared. This time they didn't come with lawyers, but with an air of false courtesy. Robert spoke first with a tense smile. "We just want to reach a family settlement without courts." Alan and David simply watched, confident in their apparent advantage. Catherine invited them into the main room, where she had laid out the table with folders, recordings, and copies of Joshua's videos. She said nothing for several minutes. She let them stare at the portrait of her brother hanging on the wall, the one where his gaze seemed to judge them. Then calmly, she played a video. Joshua on the screen looked directly at them. "If you're watching this, it's because you've attempted the impossible again. You can no longer hide what you did." The three men's faces changed color. Catherine didn't need to raise her voice. The silence of the video was enough to reveal the truth. After that confrontation, the atmosphere on the estate became tense, almost electric. The brothers left without a word, but Catherine knew this wasn't the end, but rather the prelude to a new offensive. She decided to get ahead of it. With the help of Attorney Winters and Ellis himself, she organized a formal meeting with the Mitchell brothers and executives from a rival oil company, presenting it as a meeting to resolve property disputes. On the morning of the meeting, she dressed in the grey suit Joshua had given her for their 20th anniversary, the one she had never worn for fear of appearing too elegant. In front of the mirror, she saw herself different, less a widow, more a strategist. When the guests arrived, the main hall of Maple Creek was filled with murmurs and unspoken tension. Catherine greeted them with a smile that wasn't polite, but controlled. On the table, she had placed the evidence of fraud, the geological reports, and a flash drive with copies of everything. When the Mitchell brothers left the farm, tension hung in the air like a storm that refuses to let up. Catherine, however, didn't collapse. On the contrary, she felt a strange calm, a kind of serene relief that only comes when fear is exhausted. That same afternoon, she called Winters and asked him to begin the legal proceedings to secure the property and officially register the extraction rights in her name. The lawyer, impressed by her precision and firmness, congratulated her. "You speak like someone who has been preparing for this battle for years," he said. Catherine smiled faintly. "No, I just learned not to back down when what I love is at stake." Meanwhile, Ellis and the local workers reinforced the fences, repaired the stables, and painted the barn. Maple Creek began to breathe again, this time to the rhythm of a new owner who no longer needed to hide behind the Mitchell name. The following days were a mix of physical labor and emotional healing. Jenna, now fully committed to her mother's side, was in charge of reviewing the accounts, organizing documents, and coordinating with the lawyers. At night, the two watched the last videos Joshua had left together. In one, he appeared laughing, covered in dust and sawdust, as he showed off the studio he had built for her. "Here you're going to paint again, Kathy," he said. "I want you to fill these walls with what you feel, not what you lack." The phrase remained etched in both of their memories. Catherine decided to restore the place and turn it into a small art studio open to the public, a space for women who, like her, had lost something and wanted to start over. The first exhibition was titled Maple Creek, Where Truth is Reborn, and was the starting point for the new family legacy. As the months passed, the farm visibly changed. Where once there had been silence and dust, now there were sounds of laughter, footsteps, and the soft sound of brushes against canvases. Catherine had hired young local artists to help in the studio, and Jenna organized small art fairs and volunteer days. What had once been a secret refuge had transformed into a symbol of life, a place where Joshua's memory felt like a gentle breeze, not a shadow. One summer afternoon, as the sun set behind the maple trees, Catherine paused to watch the light bathe the horses in the field. She thought that somehow her husband was still there in every detail, in every right decision he had made, without her knowing. One night, alone in the studio, Catherine opened the last unwatched video. Joshua was sitting in front of a blank canvas. "If you're watching this, it means you've made it," he said with a gentle smile. "Maple Creek belongs to you not only by law, but because you made it bloom again. I don't want you to remember my absences, but my intentions." Then she lifted a small envelope and placed it on the table. "In here is the last key. It doesn't open any physical door, Kathy. It opens the one within you." She paused the video, her heart heavy, and looked around. On a shelf, she found the same envelope, untouched, just as he had shown it. Inside was a note and a small paintbrush with a hand-carved handle. On the paper, Joshua had written, "Now paint your own future." Catherine stared at the paintbrush for long minutes, unable to decide whether to laugh or cry. She held it between her fingers, and something inside her, a mixture of nostalgia, gratitude, and peace, began to settle. She lit a table lamp and prepared the largest canvas she owned. The studio smelled of linseed oil and new wood. Outside, crickets marked the slow rhythm of the night. She picked up her brushes and began to paint without thinking, letting the colors flow as if Joshua were guiding her hand. 3 dominant tones appeared on the canvas: the gold of the wheat, the red of the maples, and a deep blue, the same as the sky above the farm. As the painting took shape, Catherine understood that the Aha's true legacy lay not in the documents or the oil barrels, but in that silent freedom of creating something new from what life had broken. When she finished the painting, she stepped back to contemplate it. 3 intertwined horizons, past, present, and future, stretched before her eyes. Her chest felt light, almost transparent, as if she had finally completed Joshua's last instruction. And if you're still here, seeing this story through to the end, she thought, share it with someone who also needs to believe that it can still begin again. She turned off the lamp, letting the moonlight illuminate the painting. In that silvery reflection, Catherine saw her own transformation. No longer the widow searching for answers, but the woman who had learned to live without fear. Maple Creek had become her testament, a reminder that even the most painful secrets can blossom into beauty when faced with truth and courage. Catherine didn't allow the canvas to be an endpoint, but rather a fulcrum. At dawn, she and Winters drafted a memorandum of understanding with the rival oil company that had shown interest during the meeting. It required quarterly external audits, strict extraction limits to protect the groundwater, a provincially administered environmental remediation fund, and a fixed percentage of royalties earmarked for scholarships for rural youth who wanted to study science or the arts. The executives, still impressed by the evidence against the Mitchells, agreed to negotiate under those rules. Jenna, who had learned more about contracts in weeks than in years of university, took care to translate the clauses into clear language to present to the community. Ellis, wearing his faded cap, toured neighboring farms, explaining that Maple Creek wouldn't sell its soul for oil. If there were ever going to be oil rigs, they would be rigs with a conscience and open accounting. In the kitchen, on the coffee-stained tablecloth, Catherine drew a diagram of 3 circles: land, people, truth. "If a decision harms any of these 3, we won't make it," he said quietly, as if Joshua were sitting next to him nodding. Weeks later, the provincial court convened a preliminary hearing on the inheritance dispute, and the courtroom filled with that nervous murmur of wooden benches and narrow hallways. The Mitchells arrived in an army of grey suits and expensive perfume that failed to hide their fear. Catherine, on the other hand, appeared with a worn notebook and a folder with coloured tabs, the same one she had arranged on sleepless, foggy nights. When the judge asked for evidence, Winters plugged in a disk and silently projected the bank statements, the overlapping signatures, the dates that coincided with Joshua's alleged incapacities. While in parallel, there were records of stock purchases and offshore transfers made by his siblings. There were no shouts. There were dates. There was no drama. There were numbers. The magistrate, with a stern expression, announced that the will's validity was upheld and that given the risk of destroying evidence, he was issuing an order to preserve all records of the Mitchell companies. In the hallway, Robert tried to approach Catherine with a "this didn't have to end like this" response. She looked at him with a serenity that wasn't vengeful but rather sanitary. "It ends as it should have begun, with the truth," she replied, and stepped out into the cold with the distinct feeling that at last the Mitchell name was learning to be pronounced without shame. When they left the courthouse, the air had a different smell: wet earth and freshly fallen leaves. Catherine took a deep breath and, for the first time in months, allowed herself a moment of silence without fear in her wake. Jenna walked beside her, holding a copy of the judgment, still in disbelief at how everything had changed. "Dad would be proud," she said quietly. Catherine didn't respond immediately. She watched a flock of geese fly south, in perfect formation, and thought that somehow Joshua had found his way home too. When they arrived at Maple Creek, Ellis was waiting with a quiet smile and a table set with apple pie. "It feels different today, doesn't it?" he commented. "Yes," she replied, helping herself to a slice. "Today this place truly belongs to us, not because of papers, but because of memory." As the weeks passed, Catherine's story began to circulate throughout the region. Local newspapers published articles about the Minnesota teacher who defended her heritage with documents and heart. Groups of women from nearby towns visited her to hear her story and ask for advice. Catherine didn't see herself as a hero. She repeated that she had only done what was necessary to honor her husband's love and the dignity of her family. But the truth is that Maple Creek became a gathering place for those who had been silenced or underestimated. The art studio was filled with color, laughter, and shared cups of tea in Aches, the evening. Even Winters, the lawyer who at first seemed distant, began bringing his apprentices there to teach them that the law is not only defended with laws, but also with ethics and compassion. The following spring, Catherine organized a special exhibit in the restored barn. The walls, once covered in dust and secrets, now featured paintings by women who had transformed their grief into art. One painting depicted a field of maple trees burning in the sun. Another, a portrait of Joshua from behind, gazing toward a golden horizon. Upon entering, visitors paused in front of a centerpiece titled The Invisible Legacy, where Catherine had painted her husband's hands intertwined with hers, holding an antique key, the same one he had left her with his will. During the unveiling, a reporter asked her how she found the strength to carry on. Catherine responded with a smile that reflected years of learning. It's not about strength, but about understanding. When you understand that love doesn't end with death, you stop fearing the beginning of anything. Jenna, watching from a corner, felt pride and calm at the same time for the first time. For months, she had worked with her mother not only to protect the heritage, but also to come to terms with her own history. One afternoon, while reviewing old emails from Joshua, they found an unopened one addressed to both of them. The subject line read, "For when the noise fades." Inside a brief message. Remember that silence is also an answer. Don't waste your life trying to be understood by those who never listen. That phrase became the motto of the new Maple Creek Foundation, an organization they founded together to offer refuge and legal counsel to women facing family or financial disputes. Catherine had come full circle, from grief to purpose, from secrecy to voice. The first winter in Maple Creek's new home arrived with an early snowfall. Catherine watched from the window as the countryside blanketed itself in white, each flake seeming to seal a chapter. Inside the house, the warm lights and the sound of the fireplace created a different atmosphere, no longer one of solitude, but of continuity. Jenna decorated the tree with ornaments she had made with the children from the workshop, while Ellis told stories of old Joshua, exaggerating some details just to make them laugh. Sometimes in the quiet of the night, Catherine thought about how much she had changed. The woman who once arrived heartbreakingly, bereaved, now knew how to mend fences, negotiate contracts, and care for horses. She felt part of the landscape, not a guest. That land that had once been a symbol of secrecy now breathed honesty. In January, a letter arrived from the University of Calgary. The art faculty wanted to include her story and her work in an exhibition on female resilience. Catherine hesitated for a few days before accepting. She was worried about exposing herself, reopening wounds. But then, looking at the paintings, lined up in her studio, she understood that vulnerability wasn't weakness, but a shared legacy. She traveled with Jenna, who documented the entire process. At the opening, in front of dozens of people, Catherine spoke firmly. Maple Creek isn't just a place, it's a lesson. There is no more valuable legacy than learning to stay when everything invites you to flee. The applause was long, warm, almost intimate. At the end, a woman from the audience approached her, crying, "Your story saved me from giving up." Catherine hugged her silently, knowing that in that gesture, Joshua was also present. Back at the farm, the routine returned to being simple and fulfilling. Catherine would get up early to feed the horses, walk the icy paths to the workshop, and then make tea with dried mint, her new ritual against homesickness. Jenna had stayed in the city for a few months to continue the foundation's projects, but they spoke every day. One night, while reviewing some financial reports, Catherine received a video call from her daughter. Behind Jenna, a small office filled with papers and coffee cups could be seen. "Mom, they just passed the inheritance protection law in cases of family manipulation. Maple Creek inspired part of the project." Catherine couldn't hold back her tears. Years ago, that phrase would have meant a battle won. Now it represented something bigger. Real, tangible change, born of pain and transformed into justice. When she hung up the call, she went up to the attic, the place where it all began. She still had the table with the blue folder and the silver laptop. She turned on the computer, even though she knew there were no more videos left. An empty folder appeared on the screen, but when she looked closely, she noticed a hidden file. Day 366. She opened it, holding her breath. Joshua, his face aged and profoundly calm, said, "If you've made it to this last day, it means the story didn't end with me. It means you chose to live, not survive. Don't look for me on the walls or in the fields. I am in what you decide each morning." Catherine smiled through her tears. For the first time, she understood that the videos weren't a goodbye, but training for life after love. Catherine slowly shut down her laptop and went downstairs, feeling each step carry a different weight, lighter, more certain. In the main hall, the fire crackled as if celebrating this silent discovery. She poured a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the snow continue to fall in slow spirals over the countryside. All was calm, but it wasn't an empty calm. It was the peace that follows the truth. She thought of Joshua and how, without seeking it, he had made her the woman she always wanted to be. She no longer needed video instructions to know what to do. Now the voice that guided her was his own. She placed her glass on the table, picked up a new notebook, and wrote on the first page, "Today my own map begins." As the days passed, that map filled with projects. Catherine and Ellis installed solar panels on the barns, organized free workshops for young farmers, and launched an educational program on sustainability. Maple Creek became a vibrant, self-sufficient community where everyone found a purpose. The story attracted the attention of universities and media outlets, but Catherine always responded with the same phrase. It wasn't a victory, it was restitution. In a local radio interview, a journalist asked her how she felt about having turned a I legacy of secrets into a work of good. She smiled, looking at the horizon. Sometimes life doesn't ask you to understand why you lost something, but rather to discover why it was taken from you. And in that instant, she knew that the farm, the paintings, and even the silence of the winters were the answer she had sought since day one. The following spring brought a literal and symbolic rebirth. The maples at Maple Creek turned a brilliant green, and the scent of damp earth permeated every corner of the farm. Catherine, wearing a straw hat and with paint-stained hands, spent her mornings combining her two passions, art and the land. She had begun a new series of paintings titled "The Silences That Bloom," inspired by the landscapes Joshua had secretly loved. Each brushstroke was a pending conversation, a way to converse with him without words. In the afternoons, she would meet with the village women to read old letters or share recipes. The farm was no longer just a refuge, but a meeting place for those who needed to remember that love, even when wounded, can continue to build. One afternoon, upon returning from the workshop, Catherine found a letter with no return address in the wooden mailbox. Upon opening it, she recognized Attorney Winter's handwriting. It was an invitation to a commemorative event in Edmonton, where exemplary cases of civic integrity would be presented. "Your story inspired more than you can imagine," the text read. Catherine hesitated, but decided to go. She didn't do it for recognition, but to close the cycle. At the event, when she took the stage, she didn't read any speeches or acknowledgements. She only said, "Defending the truth didn't make me a hero. It reminded me that true love is always an act of quiet courage." The audience rose to their feet in seemingly endless applause. In the crowd, Catherine thought she saw a familiar shadow, a tall silhouette in a grey coat, smiling from the back of the room. She closed her eyes for a second, and when she opened them, the figure was gone. But he didn't need to be. Joshua was still there, in every right decision she made. She drove back to Maple Creek that same night, her car headlights cutting through the soft mist of the country road. When she arrived, she pulled into the driveway, where the streetlights cast long shadows across the melting snow. All was silent except for the creaking of wood and the whisper of the wind through the trees. Catherine got out of the car and walked slowly to the porch. Each step echoed the past few years. The morning, the struggle, the revelation, the peace. She climbed the steps, breathed in the cool air, and looked toward the horizon, where the sky was turning a deep blue. In the distance, the horses slept under the barn, and a warm breeze brushed her face, so faint that for a moment she thought she heard Joshua's voice whispering, "You did it." She walked into the house, turned on the living room lamp, and looked at the paintings hanging on the wall. The antique key, the Alberta mountains, the russet hues of the maples at sunset. Everything told a story of resilience and love. She picked up the last blank canvas and propped it up on the easel. This time there was no instruction, no video, no note, just her breathing, and the distant murmur of winter. She painted a golden stroke in the center and then let the color expand freely, without a plan, without fear. When she finished, she stepped back and smiled. The painting seemed to breathe. "This is what freedom looks like," she murmured. Outside, dawn was beginning to break over the Maple Creek hills, illuminating the house that had once been a secret and was now a symbol. Catherine closed her eyes and with absolute calm knew she was finally home.